So how do you read ancient texts? Why did they even write them? And how are they different in the East than they are in the West? There's a lot of tricky information out there now, and I have an upcoming course where I'm going to be describing how to read ancient texts and understand astrology and the cultures of East and West a lot better. Okay, so we're starting this sacred texts course. So we got a lot to do and to talk about here. These are large concepts, and it'll probably shift your paradigm of thinking about what you're reading by the time we're done. So this first section, a primer on Indian concepts. So all Indian texts exist to describe the fundamental truth of the universe, what will be called the Veda, like the truth. And the underlying truth and worldview from India and just in general is related to Dharma, which is the truth, and Karma, which is how that truth is expressed in actions. And then how those actions come back to us to show us the truth of what our actions created and how we need to perform more skill in action the next time to get a better result, to connect to truth. It's this circle between Dharma and truth and the actions we perform, which is the karma that results and that creates the platform for the future action. So from there, we have many classifications of texts which approach that concept philosophically, scientifically, practically, and in other ways. And again, from this basic concept of Indian thought, which has to do with karma, which are actions that are related to dharma or the truth, all kinds of things unfold. And that includes things like the three gunas, which are the three qualities of life, five elements, which are the five things that everything is built upon. Again, these are principles. I'm going to talk more about this later. But all of that is even underneath of dharma, which is the truth of everything, and karma, which is that truth put into action. And it is the truth put into action. And it means the truth of how much you've learned a certain lesson, and the truth of how, when that comes back to you, it's showing you the truth. For example, this cycle. So to really distill it into these two concepts that then break off into gunas, elements, practices, principles, and all these other things, we'll talk about that as we go forward. But everything, every text, whether it's an astrology book, a spiritual text, a yoga text, a Veda, an Upanishad that's philosophical, something that's practical like an Ayurveda text, all of it cycles back to these concepts of the truth of who we are and why we're here, the essence of truth, and how that it is expressed in our actions. So the next big thing that we're really going to talk about, or the first big thing we need to talk about, is the difference between the text in India and the text from the West. Now, you might think you understand, well, of course I know why text was written, to tell us something. Yeah, but what and why and in what format? Now, the reason for text to be very different is very different in the East than in the West. We're used to books in the West to be informative and contain facts that sort of convince us of a point of view. We're used to reading things that way, expecting that to be the purpose, right? Like when I wrote a book, when I wrote my book here, it's almost kind of like a lawyer, like this is this, and here's how I can convince you, and it's sort of persuasive and convincing. But that's not the purpose in India, at least not a long time ago. The origin texts weren't really like that. In fact, it's not usually the case. The great sutras and the great, sastras, as they're called, like Bharat Prashahora Sastra, isn't persuasive at all. It's the information that you need to be able to do the thing. And if you don't know how to use that information and use those principles, then you can't do it. Then you are not qualified. So, again, many people get confused because they don't understand even why the text was written. Mysticism is not to be taken literally, for example, which is another thing to understand about the Indian text, is there's a lot of mysticism and whatnot, not literal. And again, this also goes into different texts for different purposes, which I'll talk about. But one of the science books is not the same as one of the religious books. And the reason each one was written was very different. So even what appears to be a science book can be misconstrued if not put in the proper category. For example, a book on anatomy isn't going to tell you how to practice medicine. It's meant to show you the anatomy, not how to practice. A book on astronomy will not tell you how to practice astrology. It doesn't have that information. That's not what it's for. It's to show you the order of things, like the astronomy books show you the order of things, not how to apply it. Astronomy and astrology are two different things. Anatomy and Ayurveda and medicine are two different things. That's an example just within what could be science books. Now, texts were also written to be concise, without repetition, because first they had to be memorized. Certain texts were simply written to be guidelines for a guru to teach from. Therefore, each text, or at least a lot of these texts, lacked a lot of explanatory material. They don't explain things, at least the good ones. They're just information, so that a guru would have a guideline sort of to teach from, at least at best. Again, you have to understand that the first nature of the texts weren't really even written. They were oral. You know, the information was transmitted orally. It wasn't written down until far into the history of India. And it actually represented a degrading of the vidya, of the wisdom, that it had to be written down. So you want to understand that the texts were very brief. They only contained what was necessary. I mean, this is the sacred sastras. Now, there were a lot of books that were written later that really weren't sastra. And you can tell by the way it's laid out, which I'm going to talk more about this later in the course. But in principle, you want to understand, like I'm saying, something like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It's a very little book. It's not really a book. It's a manual. It says, do this, do this, do this, do this. It's not explaining why. It says very simply, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is stilling the thought waves. When the thought waves are stilled, the being rests in their own true nature. Two statements that set everything in line, and then he tells you what to do. That's basically the text. And then there's also, this happens after a while, this happens after a while. So I'm going to get more into the specifics of the what's called exegesis in a minute. But the sastras are very concise. So I keep saying text, I should delineate between a sastra and like a book. Sastra is like Briyat Parashara Sastra. That was written by a rishi. Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a sastra on yoga. Bhagavad Gita is a sastra from the Mahabharata about how to practice yoga, karma yoga, how to perform skill and action. Very, very small. It's not a big book. Very concise. Because these things were originally memorized. They were like guidelines for the guru to teach from. They weren't meant to be convincing and persuasive and no, here's really why you should study yoga, because you know your mind is a mess and blah blah. You saw these things, these philosophical discussions about the nature of the mind and Advaita Vedanta, or things like, you know, how samskaras arrive in karma. You see these things in other books, in Upanishads and whatnot, other sacred texts. But again, they're in different categories. When you get to a sastra that's about practice, it's usually very concise. You'll see large philosophical works, or you'll see many philosophical works like Upanishads are a bit longer sometimes because they're explaining things, and then you'll see things like Puranas and, you know, the epics like the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Gita are very long. So I'll talk more about the different exact kind of texts in a bit. But many times the science books and the sastras are very concise. Because they were memorized. They weren't convincing because they were like guidelines to teach from. It was sort of just like in this PDF. I'm not trying to want to subscribe, but even if you are subscribed, you want to click this little bell that says get notified about every new video. You want to click that, and then you will be notified, and it has the little ringer on after you do that. So make sure to do that. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. It's very simple. I'm not writing a book to try to convince you how to do it. I'm actually explaining it as I go, but it's like a guideline, even this PDF. So if someone were to look at this, they would see exactly what I mean, right? So when we approach this Indian idea, though, it creates thorny problems in this day and age because there are not many gurus who actually teach from the text, and those who do may not be aware of the things I'm mentioning. So people can misconstrue the intention of certain sastras and passages in them. Many times you see people skip ahead, or they'll pull a certain line or 2 or 10 out of the middle of a sastra or out of the middle of a book without understanding the context or important supporting material and assumptions. So at best, this creates confusion in the students. When I say at best, it sort of confuses the student, like, well, how does this work? How could this be true and that be true? When the teacher is good, he can explain it, if the student will listen also. But at worst, these misunderstandings get spread as new teachings, with the idea that this sort of out of context statement is now, this changes everything. Again, this is where you see a lot these days with, a lot of the teachers who are coming out and saying that, after pulling a couple lines from a couple of the texts, they're saying, things like about zodiacs and whatnot, even though it's very out of context. It's not being looked at in the proper order and whatnot, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, you need to understand why something appears and understand the flow of how the texts are written and the sastras are written. So I'm going to read through all of these statements, and I'm going to go back and tie it together. So again, understanding the difference between Shruti and Smriti, that which is heard and that which is written, and how it affects the texts themselves. So it's a huge reason why a lot of the science from India appears to have entered from other cultures as well. Stated simply, the Indians didn't write a lot of things down until outsiders started occupying India. Mainly, these outsiders wrote in Greek, the universal language of ancient scholars, due to the emphasis on memorization. So the Indians didn't write a lot of things down until outsiders started occupying India due to the emphasis on memorization. They were memorizing the texts, and then they started, when the knowledge started to leave and go into other cultures, they were then exported back into India, but written in Greek and in other forms. In the course, as we get more into the course, I'm going to show you unmistakable evidence between like the Babylonians and the Indians, even though the stuff wasn't written down in India proper. It's hard to imagine that it wasn't shared between Babylon and India. Also, direct connections to the earliest texts in India that were actually written in Greek, then translated back into Sanskrit, and this whole kind of thing that went on, sort of controversies. But things make a lot more sense when you understand that India did not put an emphasis on writing things down because the emphasis was on the oral transmission. That not only showed this hole in a lot of their, quote, writing, but it also shows why texts were very succinct. They were concise. There's not a lot of explanatory material. And there was a specific order to the way things were written, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But just keeping that in mind yourself. Okay, well, it makes sense that a text would come from Greece, that an Indian text was originally in Greek and then translated back into Sanskrit, the language of India. Okay? It doesn't mean that the Greeks taught it to India, for example. So this emphasis on memorization is also the reason why many of the texts are so concise and brief, as I said, with the proper emphasis and arrangement. Once again, if we don't understand this principle, we can jump around and pull statements out of these books without understanding the context. You want to understand the other implication of not being very elaborate. every word then becomes important. Every sutra in the sastra becomes meaningful. You know, after writing a book myself, because there's so much that's explained, sometimes you're repeating something to emphasize it, sometimes you're doing this or that. Every statement isn't as powerful as every other one. But this was what they tried to do in the sastras, in the great texts by the rishis. They didn't want to have anything extra, and they didn't want to repeat things and whatnot. And so when I mentioned earlier that they were kept concise, part of the reason also is because the principles that were outlined were most important, and they would not repeat a lot of things, but if they did repeat it, it would show the importance, as I said here. So the basic overview of Indian exegesis, or literary, devices and scholarship, and how the texts were arranged and different devices used. So repetition, hyperbole, there's also, proximity and the order of things. So there's several principles at play with Indian texts. As was stated, things were usually not repeated. So if the concept was repeated, it means it was important. Also, you want to look for repetition of a principle to be noteworthy. So this is often how a repetition will show up, not as an explicit statement, but the repetition of a principle or a concept. So almost never do you hear them say the same thing again. It's almost like unheard of. You wouldn't say Lord Vishnu incarnated as the 9 planets at the beginning of the text, and then before you start to explain the planets, again, you would say, don't forget, Lord Vishnu is incarnated as the 9 planets. It sounds funny, but I might do it if I was writing a book now. I wouldn't say it exactly like that, but I would go, so as we know, the planets are incarnations of Lord Vishnu, so Surya is this divine quality of God, or whatever. I would mention it again to remind people, we're in a darker age, we're in a heavier age. They weren't then. But what you might see is, rather than explicitly repeat something, that they will illustrate it in another way. This is what you'll notice. And, for example, the concept of proximity in astrology is clear to see. Something is close to something else. We see the principle affirmed in the calculation of dignity, where a planet functions better when its ruler is close by. Any planet that's close to its ruler in a chart has a naturally friendly relationship with it, even if it's, or I should say a temporarily friendly relationship, even if its natural relationship is unfriendly. So like Venus and the Sun are naturally unfriendly to each other, but if Venus is next to the Sun in the chart, like if the Sun is in Leo and Venus is in Cancer or Virgo, or 3 signs in front or 3 signs behind, then Venus will be friendly toward the Sun in that chart. Venus and the Sun, they'll always have a pretty friendly relationship. They never get too far away from each other, but others aren't so much, like the Sun and Saturn or whatever. So proximity is important. We also see that same thing in the Sun and Moon yogas, where planets very close to each one of the luminaries give support. Planets before, with, or after the Sun or the Moon are supportive. Same principle. It's not the same thing, though, as the calculation of dignity, but it's the same principle. We also see the same principle in the exact calculation of aspects, right? Where the tighter and closer the aspect, the more influential it is. So it's a universal law that something that's closer to something else is going to be supportive. But we see it in astrology as well. There are many things like this. And where we also would look for the confirmation of a principle by looking at it in another source. Like we might find a rule that might be ambiguous, but we want to try to understand the spirit of the rule based on the examples that are given.